أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. So today we are going to begin our seminar lecture on Aristotle's De Anima. This is an extremely important and highly influential work from the ancient world. Aristotle's De Anima was widely disseminated in medieval Europe. It was also very closely studied in the Islamic world as well. So before we begin and jump into the topic, I like book lists, and so I don't want to make a separate lecture or video on reading list on Aristotle, but I'm going to just mention the different translations and the translation which I am going to be using. So there are many translations of Aristotle, and there are many translations of the De Anima. I'm going to be using Aristotle De Anima in the Clarendon Aristotle series, which is translated with an introduction and commentary, and the commentary is quite extensive, by Christopher Shields. Christopher Shields is a big name in the contemporary study of Aristotle. And this is a very easily obtainable and accessible edition. So you can see that the translation of the De Anima is actually only this much of the book. And the rest is all very learned commentary. So, and it's pretty detailed, but it's there if you need it. Now, there are a number of other translations of Aristotle's De Anima. A recent one is, again, Aristotle De Anima, but it's the one by C.D.C. Reeve. This is published by Hackett. Hackett publishes a lot of translations of important philosophical works, and they're bringing out a new series of the translation of all of the works of Aristotle. It's called the New Hackett Aristotle. So both of these are very contemporary and they're very readable. There's a rather odd translation, again contemporary, called On the Soul, Aristotle's On the Soul by Joe Sachs from. He was a very eminent tutor at St. John's College, where one of my children has graduated from, another one is studying at right now. But this is a very idiosyncratic translation, but nevertheless, it's useful. So I'm just mentioning these three in particular because I have looked at them and I have used them and I found them to be helpful. In terms of, if you want to actually look at the ancient Greek as well, and I am not a scholar of Greek, but it's interesting sometimes just to look at the words that are being used. So the standard affordable editions are by Loeb, and this is, you can buy them used. This is Loeb Classical Library, published by Harvard. It's Aristotle On the Soul, and there's some other works in this because On the Soul is really short. So in the Loeb Classical Library, you've got On the Soul with another work of his called Parva Naturalia, the Latin title, and On the Breath, which is interesting. So you can have and you can get this used for various, it depends on the price range. So the De Anima is a difficult book. It's a short book, but there's a lot happening there. We won't be able to do justice to it in this course. We've only got a few weeks to work on this, and I was hoping that we would also be able to then move to Ibn Sina's work on the soul, his own De Anima. Well, we'll leave that until then. So we won't be able to do complete justice to this, but we will do our best. So in toward that end, it's important to mention a few other works. So both Shields and Reeves offer a fair amount of explanation. Shields has got more, I think. It goes in more detail. But these are modern philosophers. And the modern world looks very differently on this whole question of the soul. And a lot of the modern thinkers who read Aristotle's De Anima are reading it from the point of view of something called philosophy of mind. And philosophy of mind is very different than the way that the ancients looked at things. And of course, it's also very different from what is called psychology today, because strictly speaking, Aristotle's On the Soul is a work of psychology, but that means psychology in the literal meaning, the science of the soul, because the word psyche that we have in English, and of course the P is silent, P-S-Y-C-H-E, is a kind of transliteration of the Greek term for soul, which is psyche. So, of course, Aristotle, when he talks about psyche or the soul, he's really interested in the principle of life. And so that's very different from modern psychology as founded by the extremely disturbed and deviant individual known as Sigmund Freud. Because if you're interested in the principle of life, then you're also interested in, all living things. So you're interested in plants and nutrition and growth and cats and dogs and so forth, the whole overall principle of life. And you have to understand that for the ancients, the soul, there was also a notion of a kind of disembodied sort of souls or intellects. There's some overlap with these terms, but even the planets were considered by many of the ancients to have a soul. So this is very far removed from the world of, Freud and Jung and modern psychology. And it's certainly quite different from philosophy of mind. But if you are interested in the differences, then I can recommend this book by Edward Feser on philosophy of mind. Now, the reason I recommend this particular book and this particular author is because Edward Feser is kind of a later-day Aristotelian thinker through the lens, I should say, of Aquinas. He is a Catholic. He is I would characterize him as a modern Thomist thinker. Thomist being a follower of Thomas Aquinas, who of course is very heavily indebted to Aristotle. If you're also interested in other sort of understandings of the soul by the modern people, modern thinkers, then this book, The Soul Hypothesis: Investigations into the Existence of the Soul, published by Bloomsbury by Mark C. Baker and Stuart Goetz, is interesting. And then I would also add to this list A Brief History of the Soul by Stuart Goetz as well, and Charles Taliaferro, I think is how you pronounce it. So these are not sort of popular works, but they're not extremely heavy academic works either. They're pretty readable and they're interesting. And so I thought it would be worth mentioning those. Now, in terms of understanding the De Anima, in the traditional sense that it was understood, it was a very influential work in the Islamic world, and there is an absolutely brilliant and beautiful commentary in the sense of a kind of expansion or an elaboration or a paraphrase that expands upon the text in Arabic by Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd is an extremely important figure. Unfortunately, he did not have as much recognition in the eastern lands of Islam. Well, actually, not at all until modern times. But he was influential in Europe, and he has a book in Arabic which in English is known as the Middle Commentary on Aristotle's De Anima, or the Talkhisu Kitab al-Nafsi li-Aristotle. And these are rather expensive works. This is published by the Brigham Young series in Islamic philosophy. And this is a very beautiful edition. It comes hardcover with dust jacket, and it is a dual language edition. So it has the Arabic and the English. And I have found this to be the most useful book for understanding what Aristotle said in the De Anima, because Ibn Rushd is very much an Aristotelian. He tries to stay as close as possible to the text. Another very useful work for understanding Aristotle's De Anima is the commentary by St. Thomas Aquinas. This is also very, very readable. It's deceptively small. It's not such a small work because when you actually open it, you see that it has double columns. So, yeah, there's a lot in the book. But it's also very clearly written, and Aquinas was heavily influenced or heavily indebted. He made great use of Ibn Rushd as well. No. So Ibn Rushd, coming back to Ibn Rushd, he has a number of commentaries on Aristotle, and he had short commentaries, middle commentaries, and then long commentaries. This is the long commentary.
Oh, the one okay.
Yeah. Averroes, Ibn Rushd of Cordoba, long commentary on the De Anima of Aristotle. This does not survive in Arabic. And this is based on Latin. This English translation is based on a Latin and Hebrew versions. And it is a very exacting work. Richard C. Taylor, who did the translation and the annotation introduction, has done a phenomenally detailed job and a work of immense labor in this. So finally, a modern commentary is this giant book, Aristotle's De Anima. You can find a PDF. I was lucky to get most of these pretty cheap and used here and there. But this is just extremely detailed, more than necessary, in my view. And I still think that just for sticking to the ideas and really getting an understanding of what Aristotle is saying, you can't go wrong with these tools. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, these cats. Sorry, my cat just knocked over a chair, but what can you do? Finally, but before we go on, I just want to say one last thing about books and texts. Christopher Shields, like I said, is a kind of a big name in modern studies of Aristotle, and he has a book called just Aristotle. And I mentioned that, and he often references his book Aristotle in his De Anima commentary. And the most relevant point is that if you really want to understand what Aristotle is doing in the De Anima, it's very instructive if you read chapter 2 of Shields' book on Aristotle, which is devoted to the nature of explanation in Aristotle and his theory of matter and form, which we will be getting into. All right, so a lot of things I said there about books and texts, and so you can look into those, but I think now we should make a start into the actual text. So before we do that, are there any questions so far over any of these? I didn't think so. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Right, so Aristotle jumps right in. He, in the opening chapter of book 1. Now, book 1 consists of 5 chapters, and the entire De Anima only consists of 3 books. Book 1, as I said, has 5 chapters. Book 2 has, I think, 13 chapters, and book 3 should have 12, or it's the other way around. In other words, there's 12 plus 13 is 25, plus 5 is 30. So there are 30 chapters in all in the De Anima. We can just check chapter 3. I mean, book 3. Yeah, it's book 3 that has 13. So book 2 has 12 chapters, and book 3 has 13, and book 1 has 5 chapters. In the first chapter of book 1, Aristotle is trying to make clear what he is trying to do. He says, we count cognition among the fine and honorable things and suppose that one kind of cognition is finer and more honorable than another owing to its precision or because of its having better and more marvelous objects. And for both these reasons, we may reasonably place an inquiry into the soul into the premier class of study. What do you think that means? Anybody?
Doctor,
Yeah.
yes. So I noticed, forgive me, I noticed that Shields uses cognition for his translation, and whilst other translations have knowledge or knowing.
Yep. So it might interest you here to note that Ibn Rushd in his Talkhis says, لما كنا نرى أن المعرفة النظرية. He uses the word ma'rifah, which is knowledge. So I don't know. I mean, and I don't want to pretend like I know Greek. So I don't want to, I don't even know where I put, there's so many books lying around here. What happened to the Greek? My guess is, I don't have it in front of me. He probably uses episteme, because he is trying to establish the science of the soul. And episteme is the word for science or knowledge. There is an online, some, compendium of these classical texts. I don't know if any of you, if you want to look that up, you can. Like I said,
I looked up the word, and he uses adesis or aedesis.
Okay, again, so I can't pretend to know Greek, so I don't know all these terms properly. I mean,
Yeah.
I know how to use a dictionary because I know the Greek alphabet because I studied a lot of mathematics, and if you do a lot of mathematics and physics, you learn the Greek
Yeah.
alphabet anyway. But that's it. That's it. So I don't want to pretend, but
I looked it up, and the synonym for that, in I think Scots Greek and English, is gnosis.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Gnosis. Well, gnosis just means knowledge. It's not, it
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily here mean like a kind of mushahada or
Yeah.
visioning or insight. And that's why it's cognate to the word in English know, which is why it's kano.
Yeah.
So the point is that he's looking at al-ma'rifah, and he's saying that by ma'rifah he means theoretical knowledge or cognition. He says here we count cognition. Ibn Rushd says it's theoretical knowledge or theoretical discourse, because of course Aristotle looks at there's theoretical and there's practical and then there's art. But by art, we don't mean some hideous monstrosities that you find in modern art museums, but techne, where you actually make something, crafts. So if you read Aristotle for Everybody by Mortimer J. Adler, which is a very good introductory, introduction or madkhal into Aristotle, he says, Aristotle conceives of man as the thinker, the doer, and the maker, if I'm not mistaken. So obviously, the science of the soul or psychology, the science of the psyche, is a theoretical science. And he wants to say in this first paragraph that there can be no more noble science. So the different subject matters of science are distinguished by their honor or their merit, I would say. In Arabic, Ibn Rushd has sharaful mawdu', the nobility of the subject matter. And sciences are distinguished by the nobility of the subject matter, as well as by what? By the firmness of demonstration is what he would say, or in Arabic, Ibn Rushd would say, wathaqatul burhan. And here Shields does that owing to its precision. So already you see how vexatious the situation is when we read ancient texts, or texts which are far removed from us and they're in a different language. And that's why I keep saying that, Ibn Rushd is very useful. I think that he really, really had a profound insight into this book and into other works of Aristotle. And he was a committed Aristotelian. I mean, where things get very controversial are when we try and understand what is meant by the agent intellect or al-aql al-fa'al, and everybody has their say on this. And the problem is that it's probably the most obscure passage, or the most debated obscure passage in Aristotle. What is meant by this nous poetikos, I think is the term in Arab, in Greek. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. So he's simply saying that this science of the soul is distinguished by the nobility of the subject matter as well as the firmness of the demonstration. Well, we haven't seen that yet. He's going to get into the demonstration. Now, so why is the science of the soul so important? He says, it also seems that research into the soul contributes greatly to truth in general, and most especially to truth about nature. For the soul is a sort of first principle of animals. Now, when he says animal here, I imagine probably it's something more like the notion of life in Greek, because the word for animal, like we say zoology and we go to the zoo, I think it's zoon, but I think that zoon actually means life. And in English in America, it's kind of popular lately. I think there's a girl's name also, it's spelled Z-O-E or Z if you're British, Z-O-E, Zoe.
Yeah.
It means a living, right? Or alive. And in Arabic, that's the term hayawan, because hayawan means animal, but it also means life. And in the Quran, the word al-hayawan occurs as well in reference to the hereafter, which is even more alive. Yeah. So he goes on to say, we aim to consider and ascertain its nature and essence, and then its properties. So that he's talking about the soul, of which some seem to be affections peculiar to the soul itself, while others belong to animals as well because of the soul. So this is the importance of the study of the soul. It's clear that from the beginning he's aiming to establish a science which is based on proof, which is based on demonstration or burhan, and is that this science is exceedingly important for us. At the same time, it's extremely, extremely difficult. He says, yet grasping anything trustworthy concerning the soul is completely and in every way among the most difficult of affairs. Now, if you compare with Ibn Rushd, he says that it's min as'ab al-umur. So again, it's quite close to what he's saying here. And although it's among the most difficult of subjects, he wants to establish, where does it fit in to his program of study. And that's why he says it's most especially to truth. Sorry, it also seems that research into the soul contributes greatly to truth in general. So that's line 6. And most especially to truth about nature. So that word nature is very, very important. Ibn Rushd says, that for nature he has al-ilm al-tabi'i. So what does that mean? It means physics. So the study of the soul, psychology, is actually subsumed under the al-ilm al-tabi'i or physics, as opposed to al-ilahi, al-ilm al-ilahi or metaphysics, or as opposed to al-ilm al-riyadi would be mathematics.
So then it's supposed to be undermined then rather than.
It's undermined. What do you mean?
I mean, like if he puts it under ilm al-tabi'at
Yeah.
rather than ilahiyat, that seems like more inclined towards philosophy of mind then.
Well, there is no philosophy of mind. Philosophy of mind is a modern idea. We can't read that into him. So the reason he's doing this is because what a lot of people, I think, don't know about Aristotle today. They say, oh, well, he's a philosopher. Yeah, but if you actually look at the complete works of Aristotle, I'm not sure about the percentage, the proportion, the fraction, but there's a huge amount there, which is about what we today would call biology. Aristotle's father, although I'm pretty sure he died when Aristotle was either very young or maybe even before he was born, but his I'm not quite sure, but his father, I do know, I am certain, was a physician. And, perhaps Aristotle also had some sort of an interest in this subject. I don't, he doesn't have any separate work on medicine like you find for, someone like Hippocrates or Galen from the ancient world, but he has a lot of treatises on biology and animals and the parts of animals and so forth, and how, and, he didn't just theorize about it. He had specimens, he would do dissections. There was a portion in his life where he lived in a part of the Hellenic world where there was, was by the ocean. He was able to look at specimens. Some people even claim, again, it's very hard to establish a lot of these things about the life of Aristotle. We know only the bare outlines, and various details come in, but it's disputed, all these things. But it is a fact that he did leave Athens and go to Macedon, where he was originally from, and for a short number of years, it wasn't a huge amount of time, he was the teacher to Alexander, who later becomes Alexander the Great. And it is said in some of these biographical accounts that when Alexander becomes this great world conqueror, that he used to send all sorts of specimens to Aristotle of animals from all around the world to study. And that, every single butcher and shepherd and I don't know what, all around the realm of Alexander was pressed into service to provide, specimens for the study of, for the investigations, the biological investigations of Aristotle. Now, whether that's true or not, I couldn't tell you, but it is an account which is found in these sources. All of this simply to make the point that Aristotle is interested in the soul, not just the human soul, but the soul as a principle of life. And here, Ibn Rushd says that the soul is ashraf mabadi al-hayawan. In other words, it is the most noble principle of life. Actually, the translator here has animal life, but I don't agree with that. Al-hayawan simply means al-hayat, of life as such. So the soul for Aristotle is the principle of all living things. Now here I want to focus a little bit on this word soul, if I may. So the word that's used in Greek is the word psyche. So that'll be spelled in Greek with the letter psi. And then this thing, I don't even know what it's, I think it's upsilon. Upsilon. And then chi, which is like an X, and then an eta. Psyche. If you actually search that online, I think it'll probably take you to Wikipedia, which I don't recommend, but oftentimes in Wikipedia they have the word written out in Greek. So you can, if you're curious, you can see. Now the interesting thing is that the term psyche is related to the breath. And Aristotle is very innovative. He, of course, gives a definition of the soul, which we will come to eventually. But the Greeks had their own view of soul before Aristotle. Now, we don't have time to go into all of this. And in fact, a lot of this is discussed in the remaining chapters from book 1. But the ancient theories of soul for the Greeks, there's a very important article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's just called Ancient Theories of Soul. This is much more reputable than Wikipedia and whatnot. This is a serious online source. So if you read there, you can, if you look at that, you can read about the various views of soul. So in ancient Greek culture, like in ancient Islamic culture, if you really want to look at the meanings of words, like in ancient Islamic culture, you go to pre-Islamic poetry. Well, in ancient Greek, you go to Homer. And there isn't this sort of notion of the soul that you find later in Aristotle. The Homeric poems, it says here at the beginning of this article, with which most ancient writers can safely be assumed to be intimately familiar, use the word soul in two distinguishable, probably related ways. The soul is, on the one hand, something that a human being risks in battle and loses in death. Again, you have to understand, Homer is not writing a philosophical treatise. It's an epic poem, and there's a lot of battles, and naturally people go into battle. Some come back and some don't. And so the term, the word for soul, or the notion of soul that's there, has to do with that which you can lose in a dangerous encounter that you would find on the field of battle. On the other hand, it is what at the time of death departs from the person's limbs and travels to the underworld, where it has a more or less pitiful afterlife as a shade or image of the deceased person. So going further in that article, the presence of the soul therefore distinguishes a living human body from a corpse. But that's about it. You don't really apparently have much more thought about this in Homer. And again, that's not surprising. He's not writing a treatise on the soul. But if you want to talk about what the ancient sort of usage of the term was, that's how it's used. At least that's what is written in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And again, I can't pretend to be a scholar of Greek. But I find something very interesting here. And that is when we talk about Islamic texts in Arabic. So Ibn Rushd is using the word nafs. And Ibn Sīnā will also use the word nafs. And then again, much later, and he's really the most original in this field, Mullā Ṣadrā also uses the word nafs in volume 8 and 9 of the Kitab al-Asfar. But if you want to understand what's happening in the Kitab al-Asfar, you have to understand what Ibn Sīnā said. If you understand what Ibn Sīnā said, you have to understand what Aristotle said. Hence, the importance of what we're trying to do here for people who are interested in Islamic philosophy. But within the broader Islamic tradition, we have two words, don't we? We have the word nafs and we have the word ruh. So what do you think about that? What is the difference then? The question should arise between nafs and ruh. In the Quran it says, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحِ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي. Okay. And it says, you know, they ask you, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, about the ruh. Say to them that the ruh is a command of the Lord, right? Well, the word amr in the Quran can mean command, but it can also mean affair. You know, I leave it to you to think about what it could possibly mean here. But the fact is that the word nafs isn't used. That's the point I want to make. The word nafs is used elsewhere in the Quran in any number of other senses. And both the term nafs and ruh occur oftentimes in the Quran. However, when we talk about nafs and what we're talking about here as soul in De Anima, and again, anima is the Latin term. I don't really understand why a lot of Greek texts by Aristotle, which are in Greek, are known by the Latin name, but that's the convention in scholarship. So, in case you were wondering, De Anima, on the soul, is just a translation of the Greek peri psuche, which again just means on the psuche or on the soul. So, but typically when Muslims talk about what we are calling the soul or the psuche, they typically use the term ruh rather than nafs. Now, you know, all of you who are attending this class have studied Arabic to different degrees, to different, you know, extent. What do you understand then by ruh and nafs? Because obviously they're different. And if they're used in the Quran, then of course Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala must have had some reason for using one word in one place and another word in another place. So have you ever thought, you know, what is the difference between these? And it is important for what we're doing here. But also then why is it that the philosophers like Ibn Sīnā and Mullā Ṣadrā and Ibn Rushd use the word nafs rather than ruh when they discuss this topic? Does anyone have any insight into this matter? Never thought about it? All right. So, yes, please, Sayyid Hassan, go ahead.
Afwan, I'm ruminating here.
Yes.
On this very important question. Yani, in some of the classes in the Hausa, they'll just say it's mutaradif.
Well,
yeah, right. And that doesn't jive with me. That doesn't jive with me.
It's not that simple.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't say in the Quran, وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِن نَفْسِي.
No, he doesn't.
Says, right? It's a
No.
ruhi.
And I breathed into him of my ruh. He doesn't say
ruh.
I breathed into him of my nafs.
Exactly. But then he says, Kulu.
Were you saying something, Daniel? Sorry.
No, I was just trying to after him.
Okay. Please complete.
I'm sorry, yes. And he also mentions Kulu nafsin zakat al-maut.
Yeah.
So,
Every
there-
nafs or soul shall taste of death.
right. And as we
Doesn't say
know,
kullu ruh. He doesn't say every ruh or every.
Exactly.
People translated that as spirit.
right. And we know ostensibly that etymologically, at least, nafs comes from nafas, nafasa, right, to breathe. But then I recall somewhere in a hadith, I don't recall where, but I think it was Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam who said that the ruh comes from rih, which is like wind.
Rih is like wind.
Yeah.
We would say wind in English.
Mm. So here we have, if we compare them etymologically, one comes from breath, the other comes from wind. But aside from that, from what I've gathered or understood is that they call it the ruh when, and correct me if I'm wrong, they call it the ruh when it's mujarrad, when it's asotomous, if you will. And they will call it the nafs if it's muta'alliq with the badan.
When it's a what?
Asotomous, that mujarrad, yani without a body.
Oh yeah, yeah, it's autonomous. Okay, yeah.
Right. And they'll call it the nafs if it's muta'alliq with a badan, or if it's muta'alliq
connected to some sort of a corporeal body.
Yeah, that's what I've.
That's what interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. What were you going to say?
It's the same thing I'm about to say. Like, is it when we talk about nafs, is it the descending from the God to the lower being, and then the ascending towards God is what it becomes the ruh then?
Can you all hear her? Yeah, so the audio is working. Okay. Yeah, I think there's valid what both of you have said. But when it comes to the usage in the Quran, the best source to refer to, in my experience, for Quranic usage specifically, is Kitab At-Tahqiq fi Kalimat al-Quran al-Kareem by Hassan al-Mustafawi in 14 volumes, bound in 13. The last 2 volumes are bound together. So if you look at the word ruh, so if you're not familiar with this work, his style is to look at the classical lexicons and then try and find out what is the actual root meaning. And so he has a lot of quotations for each entry, and then when he gives his opinion, he says, وَالتَّحْقِيقُ أَنَّ الْأَصْلَ الْوَاحِدْ فِي هَذِهِ الْمَادَّةِ so and so. Yeah, and he'll say that, the rigorous investigation leads us to conclude that the single principial meaning behind such and such root is Keet wa Keet, X, Y, and Z. So when it comes to ruh, he says, هو الظهور وجريان أمر لطيف ومن مصادقه تجلي الفيض جريان الرحمة وظهورها ظهور مقام النبوة وإرسالها جريان الوحي تنزيل الكتاب والأحكام ظهور مظاهر القدس والنزاهة ظهور مظاهر الحق والحكمة تجلي نور الحق وجريان. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. So essentially he's saying that ruh has the sense of manifestation, of the occurrence of some subtle affair. And among its referents are tajalli al-fayd, the tajalli, the self-revelation or manifestation in emanation, the flow of mercy, as it were, and its manifestation, the manifestation of the exalted station of prophethood and messengership, the revelation as such. In some context, the word ruh with the definite article in the Quran refers to Jibreel. But again, when you talk about wind, yes, so you can refer to rih, ruh, it comes from the same root. And that's why also there's this notion of a kind of relief or relaxing as well. But when it says in the Quran, وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي, saying, and I breathed into him of my ruh. So there's the word nafakha, it means breather, actually means to blow. So nafs and ruh are obviously related closely. So what it really is, the difference. So what I was just reading from, I forgot to say, is from volume 4, page 357, and now continuing on to page 358. He says something important. He tells you what is the difference between ruh and nafs. But before I read that part, let's read what he says about nafs. Nafs is in, the entry on nafs is in volume 12. Volume 12, page 197. والتحقيق أن الأصل الواحد في المادة هو تشخص من جهة ذات الشيء، أي ترفع في شيء من حيث هو، والتشخص هو الترفع. So the important point here is that the after rigorous investigation, the single principial meaning in this root is tashakhus, or individuation. Individuation qua the essence of the thing. That is to say, the tarafu', or the distinguishing. Tarafu' literally means to raise, right? To raise, but the prominence, as it were, of the thing, min haythu huwa, in terms of what it is, what tashakhus or tarafu'. In other words, it is that which makes that thing prominent and distinguishes it from other things. And that's why in Arabic, when you want to say the thing itself, you say blah 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 nafsuhu, or fin nafsi, or fi nafsil amr. And that's why you refer to yourself. So the term ruh does not have the sense of self, as we would say in English, but the word nafs conveys the notion of self, myself. Nafsi. So in that sense, it's like the Persian word khud, or even the word khish, which isn't used much in modern Persian, but if you've studied Persian, you understand what I'm saying. And if you haven't, then just ignore it. So that's a distinguishing feature. But what does Ayatollah Hassan Mustafawi say in volume 4, page 358? وَالْفَرْقُ بَيْنَ الرُّوحِ وَالنَّفْسِ, and the difference between the term ruh and the term nafs, or if you like, between the word spirit and the word soul, أَنَّ الرُّوحَ كَمَا قُلْنَا هُوَ مَظْهَرُ الظُّهُورِ. Okay, so as we've already noted, he says, the term ruh indicates manifestation, what tajalli, and self-revelation, or something like that. I suppose the word tajalli. Theophany, that's the word I was looking for. Thank you. Theophany. وَمَا يَتَحَصَّلُ مِنَ الْإِفَاضَةِ وَالنَّفْخِ, and that which comes about through an emanative process or emanation and expiration or blowing. وَأَمَّا النَّفْسِ فَهِيَ الْفَرْضُ الْمُتَشَخِّص الْمُطْلَقِ. And as for the word nafs, that is the singularly individual, the singularly individuated entity, simplicitaire, or mutlaqan, or in the most general sense. وَأَمَّا إِطْلَاقُ النَّفْسِ عَلَى الرُّوحِ, and as for using the term nafs to refer to ruh, in other words, as he's explained it here, فَهُوَ إِصْطِلَاحٌ فَلْسَفِي, and that is a philosophical usage. So when Mullā Ṣadrā, Ibn Sīnā, and so forth are using the word nafs, they are using it in a philosophical context, and there it's synonymous. And that's why maybe they say in the traditional Shīʿah seminaries known as al-Hawzat al-Ilmiyya, that is perhaps why they told you that they are mutaradif. But it's one thing just to say that, and it's another to explain it.
Exactly. I wanted to add a fun doctor.
Please,
Um,
please.
there is a book that I came across a long time ago, and it's called Madarij al-Quds fi Ma'rifat al-Nafs by Ghazali, Pseudo Ghazali.
Pseudo Ghazali, yeah. It's a mansubun ilayhi.
Yeah.
It may or may not be one of his authentic works.
Worked exactly correct. And in there, I recall Sayyid Naqib al-Attas.
Oh yeah.
He wrote a book called The Prolegomena to something.
Yeah, I have mine autographed copy here.
Oh.
I knew the man briefly.
Right. So he quotes from Pseudo Ghazali, and something very interesting, that he said that it's actually they're different modalities of this Jawhar al-Latifa.
Yeah, this is his. Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Right. And so the nafs, you call it the nafs. If it's muta'alliq with the badan, you call it ruh. If it's muta'alliq with the alam al-rah, you call it the qalb. If it's muta'alliq with, things of that are muqaddas, etc., and so on and so forth. So
yeah,
yeah,
that is definitely the view of Sayyid Naqib al-Attas. And there is merit in that view. And indeed that's in his book Prolegomena. And in fact, I'd heard him say that at least once. I don't remember if it was a conversation I had or whether it was a public lecture that he was giving. May well have been both, but that is definitely the view of Sayyid Naqib al-Attas, and there is merit to these explanations. So, in book one, then, Aristotle is trying to establish this science. He's indicating, that it is a science. It's part of it's subsumed under physics. It is a theoretical science that is, and therefore it is based on demonstrative principles. However, it's extremely difficult, and of course, it's very important for us to know it. And that has to do with the nobility of the science itself. But now what he wants to do ultimately in this treatise is to determine what the genus of the soul is. Now, why is that? Well, because if you want to know what anything is, in the Aristotelian scheme of things, you have to give a definition. So here we're in the realm of tasawwurat, or the realm of simple apprehension or concepts. So if we want to define something in his system of logic, you have to obviously determine the genus of the thing, and then you have to come to some sort of a definition by distinguishing that thing from all the other members of the genus by finding out its specific difference. So either he wants to come up with a ta'rif, or a actual had, mani', jama', or that's to say an extensive and intensive definition, or he has to come up with a description, a rasm, as it's called. So that's why you have to determine what the genus is.
So sorry, Afwan Ustad.
So is it a substance? Is it a jawhar? Right?
So,
and if it's a jawhar, then it's a jawhar. If it's not a jawhar, then it's an arab. It's an accident. If it's not a substance, it's an accident. If it's an accident, then it's either quantity or quality or any number of the other 7 of those things. What were you going to say?
sorry, I'm not too familiar with unfortunately, the Latin or the English. So we're looking for the hadd al-tam and the fasl al-qarib and jins al-qarib, yani.
Yeah, hadd al-tam, so a complete definition. And what did you say the other terms?
Jins al-qarib and the
Jins
fasl.
al-qarib is the proximate genus.
Proximate genus.
Yeah.
And then the fasl, you said difference?
The fasl is specific difference.
Fasl al-qarib, okay.
Yeah, fasl is the specific
difference.
And then there's something called the khassa, which is known in English or the Latin as the proprium, and then al-arad al-am is the common accident.
Okay, shukran, afwan.
No problem. So this is a huge sort of investigation, and the rest of it, he just elaborates upon all this. I don't know if we want to discuss all of this. This is pretty actually readable. Of course, all of it could be discussed, but we only have a few weeks. We don't have an entire year. But one could spend an entire year. So it's not just that he has to determine the genus, but he also has to determine, the different things that the soul does. It obviously has various activities. It has various capacities. So these are all of the things which have to be investigated. And he wants to make a point that this investigation, the way that he is pursuing this investigation, is that of the natural scientist. This is in 403A, line 29. So these are the standard reference numbers. Doesn't matter what edition you use, but that's how you refer to it. So, and every good edition will have those numbers prominently displayed. So 403A, line 29 in the Shields translation is page 3. It's the last paragraph. It says the natural science and the dialectician. So the dialectician, as really the logician, would define each of these affections differently. And he gives the example of anger. So now, before we can actually get into book 2, which is where he actually explains what the soul is. And then book 3 is going to be looking into the capacities of the soul. And the really big problem really is the human soul, because it is the rational soul. It is distinguished by rationality. In other words, it's distinguished by aql. And you will find, I think Shields, and it depends because I've looked at a couple of different translations before this, so they've all run together in my mind now. But I'm pretty sure that Shields usually uses the word reason, when what is actually what he actually has in mind would be the Arab in the Arabic of Ibn Rushd, it'll be aql. But what's in mind in the Greek should be nous. The word nous. So that's nu omicron upsilon sigma. The nu actually looks like a V. And the omicron is like an O, and the upsilon looks like a U, and the sigma actually looks like an S at the end. Final sigma. Okay, so that's really what he's concerned with in a big way in the later parts, in the concluding parts in book 3. What exactly is the nous? How do we understand that? And then, of course, another big problem is, because I'm getting ahead of the story, but he's going to identify the soul as a substance. And in fact, he says that the soul is the first perfection or completion. That's one way of translating it. The word used in Greek is entelechia. And sometimes in some translation, they just say that the soul is the first entelechi. They just make it an English word. Or the first perfection, the first completion of an organic, an organic body that possesses life and potentia. But the word entelechia actually means actuality. So you could say that it's not just the first perfection or the first completion. And in the Arabic translations, they will say kamal. And I think in some they even said tamam. But it's actually it's actuality, but they won't say fi'l, because in Arabic al-quwa and al-fi'l, potentiality and actuality, are known as al-quwa and al-fi'l. But entelechia also has this notion of actuality. So he says it's a substance, and it's a substance that is a substance such that it is the first actuality or the first perfection, etc., of an organic body possessing life and potential. But then he gets himself into some kind of a problem, because he does not permit change in the category of substance. And that's where the great originality is of Mullā Ṣadrā. But that's to get way ahead of the story. You had a question?
Yeah, I was thinking, like, if soul is a substance like a jawhar, right?
Yeah.
And jism is the substance like a jawhar.
And jism or body is a substance.
So how come the two jawhar combine together? Or it's just one's supposed to be added on, applied to something else. So is it same thing of two face? Is it just the movement of one thing becoming another from the Quwa to the fi'l?
Yeah, it's a unification, isn't it? Because the jism by itself isn't anything. It's not a living thing.
But you are saying jism is substance as well, right? And we are saying
Jism
soul
is
is
substance as well, and
as
soul is substance
So
as
how
well.
come then two unification of the Jawhar is
It's a
one needs to
completion.
be-
One is the actuality. One is the actuality of it. Otherwise, it's not a living thing. It's not a living being. then.
because they both have the capacity to be all by themselves, because we both are Jawhar. Or I'm talking about the one point
This
with two
this
different-
is this is the thing. This is the thing, because it would seem that if it's just a completion, then when the body is done, then the soul is done.
right.
On the view of Aristotle, that's what it would seem. So these are the sort of ambiguities and problems that are there, and I don't really have an answer for that. It's really not until Mullā Ṣadrā that
So when he
you
says
get all these
substance-
things sort of
So when he
sorted
says
out in a
soul is substance, it means he's talking about just the essence and nature then
Mhm,
of something.
mhm.
Or that something is different and the nature is different and the essence is different then. Three things of the same thing.
Three
You know, when-
thing,
I'm like, when he's saying substance, what it means then, because then now I'm confusing with Ibn Sīnā and then Mullā Ṣadrā. So what he means by substance, soul is substance, what it means. Can we identify it?
mhm, mhm.
Can we point it out towards it? Or is supposed to be mujarrad when it comes to substance, defined by Aristotle?
Really not sure.
Does he use usia as substance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have the Greek here in front of me.
I think he
Because
used the word usia, I
He
think.
should use back here where he says to determine the genus of whether it's a substance, he has to use usia. But the fact is that when he gives the definition of
Usia is
soul,
for the essence, right? He used.
yeah, but later in book 2 where he actually gives the definition, he just straight away says that it's the completion, that it's the entelechia, it's the in other words, he straight away says that. He doesn't, strictly speaking, that I guess he gives a description, he doesn't give a definition.
Right. Because sometimes he might use the substance as being or it's just
Yeah,
to be yours.
yeah, so he's actually giving a description when he actually does give the ta'rif. He doesn't give a had, he gives a rasm, doesn't he?
There's hamle avali then when it comes to substance defined by.
Mhm.
Right.
So in the rest of this, all he is doing is looking at what everybody's said before him. This is a style that he has whenever he deals with any subject, is to look at the accepted or reputable views or opinions of people who came before. And in Greek, I think it's called endoxa.
Endoxa.
Yeah. So he looks at those reputable opinions of his predecessors. So in chapter 2, he says it is necessary as we inquire into the soul, even as we are going through the problems which those making progress must solve, to collect the opinions of those of our predecessors who have expressed views about the soul, so that we may embrace what has been said rightly, and if anything has not been said rightly, that we may guard against it. So obviously, it's very clear that those things that are ensouled, as he says, or have a soul, are different from those things which do not have a soul. So to state the obvious, I mean, anybody can distinguish between a living entity and a non-living entity. And you can tell if the thing is alive or dead. What is ensouled seems to differ from what is not ensouled, chiefly in two respects, he says. This is so it's the beginning of book 2, so I'm at 403b, line 26, 25 and 26. So what are these two things? In two respects.
Sorry, the Becker numbering was 403 or
403b, 25, 26, 27. Yeah.
okay, thank you.
So let's start again. What is ensouled seems to differ from what is not ensouled, chiefly in two respects: motion and perception. Al-haraka is the word in Ibn Rushd. These are also very nearly the two features of the soul which we have taken over from our predecessors. So now he wants to look into what the predecessors have said with respect to this concept of these two concepts of motion and perception. So there's a number of thinkers he's going to look at, and the first one is Democritus. So in the Shields, this is on page 5. We're in book 2 now. If you have, sorry, we're in chapter 2. Yeah. And that's just 404. It's actually 403b, line 31. Line 32, excuse me. On this basis, Democritus says that the soul is a sort of fire and heat. Okay. So in the thinkers that he's going to look at in this, the reputable opinions, the established views, the endoxa in Greek, you will find a recurrence of certain terms which refer to the elements. Now, I think this term for elements, the 4 elements, I think it's in Greek is stoichia or stoichian or something like that. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. And there were different partisans of different elements as being the most fundamental among the pre-Socratic thinkers. So for the 4 elements, you have, of course, fire and air and water and earth. And it's later that you get a theory of all of the 4 elements together. So among these early thinkers, so-called physicists, they were looking for the ultimate principle of the universe, and they would favor this element or that element. And then I think it's much later, it's Empedocles who talks about 4 elements as opposed to 1. So you have a similar idea at work here when trying to understand what the soul is. So Democritus is saying that the soul is like, he says a sort of fire. Now I think at this point in history, it's probably impossible to really determine what these guys actually said.
Yeah.
We're relying on what Aristotle is saying, and many scholars of Aristotle say that when he quotes his predecessors, he often doesn't really present them in the best light, or maybe he presents a caricature, or maybe he presents a what's called a straw man, not necessarily giving the best argument for the opposing view. And there are these two kind of pictures of Aristotle. If you look in the ancient biographies, on one view they have him as this really wonderful, magnanimous man, and he was just a wonderful chap and a wonderful human being. And then you have other views that say no, he was actually a real arrogant and pompous person, and he used to put people down and so on and so forth. And if you read chapter 1 of the book by Shields and other biographies, then you can see that more than likely the characterization of him as this way of being sort of very overbearing and pompous and arrogant is probably just a posthumous attempt at character assassination, or a contemporaneous attempt by jealous people, because we have a portion of his will, and that's really his only sort of personal document that shows that he was quite concerned about his, in fact, he freed all of his slaves and all this kind of thing. Anyway, but having said that, Aristotle does kind of dismiss the people who came before, and he doesn't really go into much detail of what their view actually was. So sometimes he just mentions, like, in passing, and then he's just going to dispense with this. So he says that Democritus says that the soul is a sort of fire and heat. For the shapes and atoms being infinite, he says that the spherical ones, like the so-called motes which appear in shafts of light coming through windows, are fire and soul. You have to understand, you have to know a little bit about these thinkers. Democritus was an atomist. So he believed that everything was composed of these different sorts of atoms, and they don't have a modern physics view of atoms. They're these tiny, particles that are, and they have some sort of geometric shape. And so it appears that he's arguing that these atoms, the soul is some sort of, fiery spherical entity. And beyond that, we don't really know what Democritus really meant. And I don't, again, like I said, I don't know if it's really possible. And we can just sort of laugh, or we can just sort of think, how strange, but that's really all we've got. So that's the view of Democritus. And apparently another Greek thinker by the name of, again, I'm not sure how this is pronounced, Leucippus, was to some degree in agreement with Democritus. So his criticism of this is that, in so speaking, they suppose that the soul is what provides motion to animals. It is for this reason that they also say that the mark of life is breathing. For when what surrounds a body contracts it and squeezes out those figures providing motion to animals because of their never remaining still, help comes from without when other shapes of this sort enter in breathing. For these hinder the one still present. So even though he's sort of describing what apparently their view is, he obviously is saying this with, I think, some degree of disdain, or he doesn't agree with it. And he maintains the idea that, well, even though if we don't agree with these previous views, we will learn something by going through them. In other words, we're going to learn just how bad and how inadequate these previous attempts are. And then you'll see how much better my attempt or my answer is going to be. So I think this idea of fire has some notion of heat, because, to state the obvious, when a living being dies, they go cold, right? And they cease to move. And obviously they don't perceive. The body is, and then, if it's, even if it's a plant, plants also have a kind of rigor mortis, like a stiffening, don't they? They just sort of shrivel and they blow away. Of course, in our view, the prophets and the imams and certain very saintly individuals do not undergo these kind of processes. There, it is true that they die, but the physical matrix which is left behind does not undergo the necrotic decay processes. But anyhow, that's just by way of a side comment. Now, he doesn't go into any serious detail here, but he indicates that the Pythagoreans had a similar view. So in 404a, we're at about line 17. Yes, we're at line 17. It also seems that what was said by the Pythagoreans contains the same thought. For some of them said that the motes in the air are the soul, and others that it is what moves these motes. They spoke of these because they are seen to be continuously moving even when the air is still perfectly still. You understand this idea about motes, what he's talking about? Like, if you sit in a room that doesn't have any lights on, and it has a window, but there, and it's heavily curtained, and you open the curtain just a crack or a sliver. And if the sun is shining through, you will have like a beam of light, and then you will see some what they call motes. It's just particles of dust swirling around. Now, what Aristotle doesn't say, and this is just my opinion, wallahu a'lam, I'm just putting this here for discussion. I don't really know what they had in mind here. All I've got is what Aristotle says, but there is an interesting idea in certain Islamic texts, which I want to bring your attention to, and then I would like to know your reaction. So there is an important book called The Mystical Vision of Existence in Sahal ibn Abdullah at-Tustari by the German Jesuit Orientalist who teaches at Yale, Gerhard Böhring. And Sahal ibn Abdullah at-Tustari espouses a doctrine there, which is actually a Shīʿī doctrine. I remember I read this book many years back. But Sahal ibn Abdullah at-Tustari talks about how in the Azal, in the pre-eternity, before any of us came here, we pre-existed as motes of light in a column of light, which was called the Amud al-Nur. But this Amud al-Nur concept is there in Shīʿī hadiths, where we talk about how the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was a pre-existent light. This is the doctrine among the Sufis of an-Nur al-Muhammadi ﷺ, or al-Haqiqatul Muhammadiyya, the Muhammadan reality ﷺ.
What's the name of the book?
The Mystical Vision of Existence. And so in Shīʿī texts, of course, the Imams are included in this. And in much of the ziyarat literature, for example, a ziyarat al-Jami'at al-Kabira, you have this idea that that the Ahlul Bayt were lights circulating about the throne of God. And in a ziyarah which many Shia recite on a daily basis about Imam Hussein, they say, "Kunta nuran fil aslab al-shamikha wal arham al-mutahhara, lam tunajjiska al-jahiliyatu bi anjasiha wa lam tulbiska min mudlahamati thiyabiha," etc., etc. So, you were a pre-existent light, and that this light has traveled through the psychosomatic matrix of people of pure loins and pure wombs until those exalted individuals became manifested in this world in a human form, in a corporeal form. So this idea of a column of light and motes of light, I think, is very interesting. Is this what Democritus, Leucippus, Pythagoras had in mind? Maybe they did. Wallahu a'lam. Now, in this vein of free sort of speculation, shall we say, I would like to also bring to your attention an important article by Sayyid Hussein Nasr in his collection Islamic Life and Thought. The article, this is State University of New York Press, 1981, so that's Albany, New York. The table of contents, it's chapter 15 or article 15, Mullā Ṣadrā as a source for the history of Islamic philosophy, pages 169 to 173. In that article, there is an intriguing footnote. I don't know, but I referred to the wrong one. As I request your patience for a moment. Yeah. So he's referring here to an important observation that Mullā Ṣadrā had about some of the ancient Greek pre-Socratic thinkers. This is on page 170. Mullā Ṣadrā, through intellectual penetration and with astonishing lucidity, these are the words of Sayyid Hussain Nasr, was often able to arrive at the meaning of certain ideas held by Muslim or Greek philosophers. In the latter case of the Greeks, at ideas which were sometimes difficult to understand through sheer historical analysis alone. For example, in the first journey of the Asfar, he discussed the view of the pre-Socratics concerning the basic substances of which objects were formed. Concerning Thales' belief that all things are ultimately made of water, he writes that the water of Thales is symbolic. It is a rams, he says, and should not be mistaken for physical water. Rather, it is that ultimately divine substance, which in Islam is called the breath of the compassionate. Nafasur Rahman. And there's a famous hadith in which the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that, inni ajidu nafas ar-Rahman min qibla al-Yaman, or kama qal sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that I sense the breath of the merciful blowing from the direction of the Yemen. He said this on one occasion. The hadith is in the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. I do not have my copy of the Musnad. It's a big book, as you know. Otherwise, I could show it to you, but rest assured that it is there. So he continues, Sayyid Hussain Nasr continues, one is astounded by this conclusion, which, although opposed to the rationalistic interpretations of 19th century historians of philosophy, affirms the view of the most profound contemporary students of Greek philosophy, such as Francis Cornford. In fact, had Cornford known the Islamic term, breath of the compassionate, nafas ar-Rahman, he would surely have seen its affinity and, in fact, near identity with his own understanding of the meaning of water in the doctrine of Thales. Footnote 3. In footnote 3, Hussain Nasr, footnote 3 appears on page 173, says, see especially Cornford's Principium Sapientiae, New York, 1957, and his From Religion to Philosophy, New York, 1958. You can find PDFs of these. I don't own these books. And he writes, and he indicates that he's sort of going out on a limb, and Sayyid Hassan has one of the books. So the point I'm trying to make here is, just as you can sort of, again, we're speculating, we're almost guessing, in terms of what is meant by these motes, or what is meant by water in Thales, that there is a kind of symbolic language. This is the people who come before Socrates are in a stage of, again, and I don't subscribe to kind of evolutionary kind of conception. Those of you who know my views and have seen my videos on René Guénon, you know this. So I'm not espousing that. But before the age of Socrates and Plato, it is a mythopoetic language which dominates. And so fire doesn't always mean fire. And I don't want to keep going on and on about this too much, but you find the same thing at work in other languages and other civilizations, especially the Indic, if you study Sanskrit works, if you study the Veda. And the Vedic Sanskrit is different from the later Sanskrit. And a lot of times when the word sun or horse or what have you is used, that is not literally what is meant. And some of this is explained in the texts known as the Vedanta school, known as the Upanishad. And oddly enough, a lot of this was translated into Persian in the time of Darashikoh, the prince of the Gorkhanid dynasty, which is also known as the Mughal dynasty, rather wrongly so, but anyway. And in modern times, this is mentioned by, he's kind of a modernist thinker in some regards, but he had quite deep insights into the Veda, and he is Sri Aravind, but since he was Bengali, he is known as Sri Aurobindo. and he had a book called The Secret of the Veda. And he had compiled a kind of Vedic dictionary in which he talks about this symbolic language, right? So this may well be what is at work here. Wallahu a'lam, and Allah knows best.
So most of them associate soul with the motion.
Mhm.
So what does that mean by motion when it comes to soul? Like,
It just means that living things move, and living things move of their own accord. So if I pick up a stone, the stone cannot move on its own accord. It has to be moved by something. I can throw it,
okay.
and that kind of impetus, or what is provided to it, was called in the ancient physics, in Arabic, al-harakat al-qasriya, a forced motion, or it could be moved by the wind, or there was this idea that things that in which the element earth predominates fall down because they go towards the earth. Things in which air or fire dominate, they go up. Right. So living things have the ability to move on their own accord. They can walk, they can
But that
take up
ability to
voluntary
move is not
motions,
supposed to
and
be-
even plants, they follow the sun, right? Or they blossom. There is some sort of movement.
So that movement is not supposed to be physical in nature. I'm just thinking about it. Like,
What do you mean physical in nature?
so you're not supposed to be like walking, like motion means like you're walking on your feet, but the motion is also like you don't know today, but tomorrow you know. So that movement is also be measured as motion, right? Or no?
Yeah.
It's
So
not-
so he later says that there's motion is locomotion, which is
Yeah,
naql
yeah.
from place to place, but it's also alteration, not alternation,
Yeah,
alteration.
Okay.
In Arabic, Ibn Rushd, istihala. Naqla, istihala, and then numu is growth,
Right.
and then idmihlal.
Right.
Idmihlal is even used in Urdu, but it's not. कोई कहता नहीं है, लेकिन लिखते हैं. बिल्कुल मुज़महिल हो गए.
Okay.
Right?
Okay,
But
yeah,
in Arabic, idmihlal has the sense of decay,
Right.
demise, I think. He later says that there's these different kinds of motion. Yes,
Aristotle's definition of motion, is it more or less the same in Islamic philosophy when they say
the problem is that when in English they often translate motion,
It's not from the poor to the fair.
I forget what the word is in Greek. It's from what we get the English word kinetic.
kinesis? Yeah.
Kines something, I don't want to guess, but it's some word like that from which we get the word kinetic in English, and that's what in Latin becomes, I think, motu.
No, I have no idea.
Yeah, and then in Arabic it's haraka. So
it's
haraka can also mean change, and by the same, so motu is also meaning change, and the Greek word also is used in the sense of change. That's why motion also has alteration. It's not so motion in terms of what in modern physics we call rectilinear motion, moving in a line, or circular motion.
Mhm.
In a less technical modern physics sense, we just call it locomotion. Yani naql, movement from one place to another. And then there's alteration, right? And there's growth. And then there's other kinds of change. There's other kinds of change.
Right. So it's not what they would term as correct me if I'm wrong, خروج من القوة بالفعل تدريجا.
He doesn't mention that here, but alteration implies that, I would say.
Alteration of what? Okay.
Yeah, because alteration, Ibn Rushd says istihala.
Istihala then
Istihala, you're right, is change from one thing to another, right?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure. This is worth looking again, see what is in the commentaries, but
Okay.
But for now, that it's the only point here is that he's just running through all these previous thinkers, and then actually in chapters 3, 4, and 5, he specifically attacks particular views, where here he's just sort of listing them. Then he doesn't specify who in line 21 and 22. He says, also drawn to the same thought are those who say that the soul is what moves itself. In other words, that the soul is some kind of fire, or right? So those who say that the soul is what moves itself, for all of these seem to have supposed that motion is most characteristic of the soul. So they're all right about that, and that all other things are moved because of the soul, while it is moved by itself because of their never seeing anything initiate motion without itself being in motion. In a similar way, Anaxagoras too says that the soul is what causes motion. And with him is anyone else who claims that reason set the whole universe in motion. So again, reason I think is nous here. But Anaxagoras doesn't completely agree with Democritus. So apparently Democritus, he says it's fire, but then he also identifies soul and reason. So again, it's very difficult, to really know truly what these people meant for all of these reasons. So now let's go further on 404b line 13. This is page 6. Thus Empedocles makes the soul from all the elements. So, you can say soul is fire, but Empedocles says that it's all of those together. And Plato also makes the soul from the elements. Plato does this in the Timaeus. That's a really important dialogue. Plato is much more readable than Aristotle if you've never read the Timaeus. So then you should maybe have a look at that at some point in your life.
Isn't Timaeus about Atlantis?
I don't think so. I think that
Timaeus and Critias
is in the Critias, yeah. And another one. Maybe it is. I don't remember.
Okay, sorry.
Atlantis is in the Critias for sure.
I believe it was 2 dialogues, and it looks familiar, the Timaeus. Sorry for the interruption.
No, it is 2 dialogues. It's the Critias and another one. Should we just check? You want to check? Or, oh, okay, go ahead. You can search that if you like.
Okay. Timaeus.
It is the Timaeus, yeah.
Yeah.
Critias and the Timaeus talk about Atlantis.
Interesting. Okay. Sorry.
What were you saying? Yeah, so Empedocles. So Empedocles is taking all 4 elements. Plato is also, in some way, looking at the soul as being composed of the elements. But there is also the notion that the soul is a number, but he hasn't come to that yet. There is sort of that idea in Plato. He says, similarly, in the work on philosophy, it was determined that the animal itself is from the idea of the one itself, and the primary length, width, and depth, and that the others come about in a similar way. He put it in yet another way. This is talking about Plato. Reason is the one, knowledge the two, the dyad, for it goes in one way to one point. Opinion, the number of the plane, and perception, the number of the solid. For while the numbers were said to be the forms themselves in the first principles, they are from the elements, and some things are judged by reason, some by knowledge, some by opinion, and some by perception, and these numbers are the forms of things. So then if you combine all that together, as he says further down, you can come to the conclusion that the soul is a self-moving number.
Doesn't that just indicate that this is a Rams?
It would have to be, because I don't really see what else it can mean. Because again, you see, for people like Plato, it's actually a number form or a number idea. So in other words, the soul is some kind of a Platonic idea. And they identify the numbers also as being some kind of Platonic ideas. And then so the soul is some sort of because it moves, it's a moving number. But Aristotle hates this idea. So here he's just elaborating, making more remarks about Democritus and about Anaxagoras. So he says that although he doesn't agree with this idea that the soul is a fire, or akin to the element of fire, on 405a, line 9 to 10, he says that Democritus was a bit more subtle than the others in his view, because he identified the soul and reason as being identical. Whereas Anaxagoras, further down, a few lines down, saw the soul and reason to be different. Thales, the guy we met earlier who said that the ultimate principle of things was water, also agreed that the soul was something productive of motion. And here he has a remark about magnets. So he said that, the magnet has a soul because it can move, cause other things to move. Diogenes said that soul is akin to the element of air, or says that it is air. The reason he says this is because that is the most fine-grained and most subtle of things. Heraclitus, who's famous for saying that, everything is change, he says that the soul is the first principle, if indeed it is the rising vapor from which other things are constituted, and he says that it is the most incorporeal and is always in flux. Again, Heraclitus is the guy in favor of flux. So for him, the soul is in constant change. Alcmaeon seems to have made suppositions about the soul similar to theirs, for he says the soul is immortal because of its resembling the immortals. And he says that this belongs to it on the grounds that it is always in motion. For all divine things too are always continuously in motion. You have to understand that they saw the heavens as being divine. So the moon, the stars, and so forth are in motion. And not only are they in motion, they're in the most perfect form of motion. For the most perfect motion for the ancients was circular motion.
Sorry, Ustad, I just wanted to point out that Alcmaeon, if correct me if I'm wrong, if you've come across this, but ostensibly they say in academic research, and I believe in the entry in EI2, Encyclopedia of Islam 2, that this is possibly Luqman al-Hakim.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Luqman mentioned in the Quran, right? Then he mentions Hippo, someone named Hippo, as one of the cruder thinkers who identified the soul with water. So on the next page, then he's basically sums up. He says basically all of the elements found someone to be a proponent, except the earth. No one has declared the soul to be earth, except insofar as some have said that the soul is or is from all of the elements. I don't know why no one said that. So then he summarizes. In summary, then, they all define the soul by three things: motion, perception, and incorporeality. So it's the principle of movement within things and perception, of course, life. That's already assumed, and then it's not a body. And each of these guys then tried to refer this back to one of these principles. For this reason, even those who define it by knowing make it an element or from the elements, speaking in a manner similar to one another with one exception. I guess that was Hippo. For they say that like is known by like, for since the soul knows all things, they constitute all from all of the first principles. Those who say that there is some one cause and one element assume the soul too is one, fire or air. Those who say the first principles are more than one also make the soul more than one as well. Only Anaxagoras says that reason is unaffected and that it has nothing in common with any of the other things. So it's Anaxagoras. How or by what cause it knows if it is of such a sort, he did not say, nor is it clear from what he said. And it's a pity we don't have access to the writings or the original statements of these people. Those who recognize pairs of opposites among the first principles also constitute the soul from opposites, while those who recognize one or the other of the opposites, for example, the hot or the cold or something else of this sort, likewise assume the soul to be some one as well. For this reason, they have taken a cue from words. Those who say that the soul is the hot say that living is so named because of this. Again, this notion of heat. While those who say that the soul is the cold say that it is so called because of respiration. Respiration has a cooling effect. So these are all the views, he says. These then are the views handed down, the endoxa, down to us about the soul, as well as the reasons why they were advanced. Now, in the remaining, it's almost 2:00, so in the remaining chapters, he's just arguing against certain things. So in chapter 4, he's saying that the soul is not an attunement or a harmony. So some people said this, that it is the attunement or harmony of these principles, or of those elements. There's actually an interesting line of poetry in Urdu that's along these lines. There was a Hindu Urdu poet from Lucknow named Braj Narayan Chakbast. He's known as Chakbast. Have you heard of him? He says, Zindagi kya hai? Anasir mein zuhur tartib.
Oh, okay.
Maut kya hai? Inhi anasir ka pareshan hona. It's a well-known line.
Yeah.
So he's saying, what is life? It is simply the manifestation of order among the elements, the 4 elements, right? What is death? It is simply the dissolution, as it were, or the agitation of these elements. So maybe he has something in common with the people who said it was a harmonia. In chapter 4, he also argues that the soul is not moved. It can't be moved by other things. It cannot be moved in its own right. And then also, soul is not a number. The soul is not composed of elements. And I think I skipped chapter 3. In chapter 3, he argues that the soul itself need not be in motion to cause motion. So the soul for him is unmoved. And I think that just to sum up, because it's almost 2:00, we're supposed to, strictly speaking, start at 12 and finish at 2. If any of you have read the Physics of Aristotle, he argues in that, he has a proof for the existence of God, and God is the unmoved mover. So the soul is a kind of unmoved mover, I would argue. That's one reason he's very interested in this whole question of motion. And it's now in book. So that's book 1. He basically is talking about the importance of this subject, that it's that it has the most noble subject matter. It also is a theoretical science. It can be based on demonstrative proofs. We really need to determine what the genus of the soul is. And everyone can recognize that it's the principle of life, that living things move, they have perception, so on and so forth, what we've all gone through. And before he gives his own opinion, he wants to go through what these others have said, and that's what he does. And then it's really in book 2 where we get into the real, subject matter of the De Anima. And that is what is really influential in Islamic philosophy. I don't really think anybody cared too much about all of these other little statements, although Ibn Rushd does make it a point to talk about them. And of course it's Ibn Sīnā and then Mullā Ṣadrā who later developed their own elaborations of the doctrine of the soul, and I think that they each of them tried in their own way to fill in some of the blanks that we'll see and resolve some of the problems in this text in creating their own De Animas, as it were, and creating their own treatises on the soul. So that's all pretty much I have to say about that. And I think next time we'll try and do about maybe about half or so of the next book. And of course, we're going very, very quickly, but my aim, of course, was just to give a kind of an overview, because what we're really interested in ultimately is to read Avicenna and then ultimately to read Mullā Ṣadrā and his doctrine of the soul.
So
now we
according
can
to
just
him,
have free-form discussion.
so
Yeah.
according to him, soul is not in motion, or is in motion in itself.
Emotion. Oh, I thought you said emotion.
motion.
In motion.
Yeah.
No, the soul is not in motion. It's the
then
principle
how-
of life, and it can cause motion in others.
It can cause motion.
Yeah. So if you have some sort of a living thing, if it's alive, if soul is present, if it is ensouled, then it can move according to which order of being it belongs to. So the plants have the most limited motion.
Mhm.
And animals and humans, of course, have much wider range of locomotive power, right?
So once that soul depart from the body, then the soul itself has no motion.
Well, this is the thing. Does the soul depart? You see, for people like Plato, the soul has a pre-existence. It comes into the body, but this is not clear about Aristotle, because if it's just a completion or a perfection of some aspect of the body, then it's gone after that, isn't it?
Mhm.
So his definition has tied it very much to the body. But then, the Muslims use the same definition, except they just have it in Arabic. How does it go? Kamalun awwalun kamalun awwalun li jismin aliyin dhi hayatin bil quwwa, I think.
Or something.
And the weird thing is that they all have that one. They all have that same definition, down to our own day, down to Hasan Zada Amri. They're just quoting that one. It's the same in the Manzuma of Sabzawadi. It's the same in Mullā Ṣadrā. It's the same in Ibn Rushd. It's the same in all of these guys.
So this definition is when it is associated with the body, because if it says mujarrad, we cannot define it,
Yeah.
right? It's confusing.
Yeah, that's why I think that it's really Mullā Ṣadrā who's really
Yeah.
kind of solved the whole thing, by he says that it's jismaniyatul huduth, ruhaniyatul baqa, that it is originated with the body. And it abides thereafter. Ruhaniyatul baqa. I don't really know how to translate that nice little statement. Jismaniyatul huduth means that it originates with the body, but then it persists afterwards. And so that's, of course, connected with this whole, or it subsists afterwards, I should say, with this whole idea about change in the category of substance.
So Kamali Awal is going to be
First perfection, first completion, first
the
actuality.
Noetam then, right?
The what?
The no atam, like it's completed is
The complete species.
yeah, for that matter of fact. For the insan, if you are saying, but particularly animal, enough kamal al-awwal
Mhm.
is what?
For an animal.
Completion, yeah. For a human, it's the completion of what then? Like when we say kamal al-awwal, it means supposed to be from the core to the field. It achieves kamal, then it's gonna be what then?
It's just alive on the barest level.
Okay.
Right. It means that it has its, if it is a normal human being, then all the senses are functioning and so forth. But that's not the end of the story.
No.
Any number of things can happen. But what I always wonder about, here's a topic that I think is related to this.
Mhm.
And it's a controversial topic. It became a huge deal in the United States because of the overturning of this so-called, not so-called, of the overturning of this Supreme Court decision, the Roe versus Wade decision or case. Because if you actually look into what Islamic scholars say, and let's just stick with the Shi'i jurists. The Sunni jurists are similar, but let's just take it if you take the Shi'i jurist like a Sistani, if you go on his webpage, I mean, I don't know if this is, I haven't checked in a while, so I'm assuming that he hasn't changed his mind, right? But they'll say that abortion is haram once the soul enters the body. But they never explain when that is. At least I've not been able to find in the fatwas of Sistani him explaining when exactly that is supposed to be. And then different Sunni jurists will pin it down.
The heartbeat or something.
They'll give some figure or so forth, but they never define what the soul is, and they never really get into this question. But if we take the definition of Aristotle, then it would seem that, except in very extenuating circumstances, then that ijhab, as it's called in Arabic, abortion, would be completely haram. Because if the soul is that potentiality, then that potentiality is right there from the beginning, because the cell divides. Only living things grow, and that cell division is a kind of growth. It is a change. What do you think about that?
So when they talk about abortion or something like a Sharia point of view,
Yeah.
don't you think the age matters when it comes to the Sharia point of view?
Age?
Like if you're saying that somebody who's 14,
Mhm.
something are haram on it or halal on it, but before then it's not.
Right.
So if we're talking about from the point of the Sharia, then it might have the time limitation. Like we are not talking about
Exactly.
a cell division,
So-
right? So
No, but tell me then, when does the soul, and then when you say if you say it's haram once the soul enters the body, then my question is, when does the soul enter? And then what do you define by body?
so I think
Is simply the
maybe when the cell has
fertilized, is that going to be a
No.
body or not?
it's going to be a potential to become anything then, right?
Well,
Like a stem cell, right?
I don't know.
So
I don't have an answer. I'm just posing a question.
I would say according to when we are saying according to the Sharia, then the age is what causes everything. Like the time is what causes everything. Things become haram once the age and the time is.
Yeah, a time or age factor is
Right. So I think the abortion, when it says it's haram, maybe it's because of that particular time. Now it's becoming the shape of something, or
no.
the
So
cells
tell
are-
me, when does it happen? Quote me anyone.
I mean, like
What does
according to-
Sistani, what does Wahid Khurasani,
I don't know. They are saying 6 weeks
Khomeini,
or
anybody
something like
living dead, Bashir Najafi, Ishaq Fayaz, what do they say? I
that.
don't know.
I think 6 weeks or something, according to them, if I'm not mistaken.
How do they know that?
Maybe the heartbeat or something, because it's just a accumulation of cells, right?
Mhm.
And once the heart start beating, and heart start beating means that the cells accumulate in a form of heart and then start beating. Now they are pronounced okay. Now it's a form of of a
Yeah, I'm
specific
not
case.
arguing for one position or another. I'm kind of.
That's what I
I'm
think
I'm
that
talking in a
means from the
Socratic
biological
mode.
point.
I'm asking questions.
No, it's still
Yeah.
called life though.
It's alive.
It's still called life because it is going to be. It's in Bilquwa then. at
Okay,
that
so
time.
you're saying that
From the
there
Sharia
is a
point of
time
view,
restriction. Okay,
Right.
I understand that. But then my question is, how do we know what that time is?
biologically you can find out, right? When the
They
cells
don't argue
start-
biologically. You think that those guys sitting in Qom have studied biology? They're going off of some hadith or another. Sayyid Hassan?
Yeah, I think everybody has different epistemic bases. Every marja has different epistemic bases. That's why I tend not to, all due respect to them, but I tend not to more or less care about those ulama or maraji that have not studied philosophy or have not studied anything about theosophy. And so therefore,
Well, then that's pretty much all of the big names who are followed by people.
exactly. So
Officially, they're anti-philosophy. You know, maybe they have some private view, but as far as I know, Sistani is not pro falsafa and Irfan. Ishaq Fayaz is not pro falsafa Irfan. Bashir Najmi is not pro falsafa Irfan.
not at
Wahid
all.
Farzani is not pro. So who is there? I guess Bahjat, but Bahjat is no longer among us.
I don't think Bajat was either, but when it comes to these issues, Jawadi Amali is one. He's a marja, but he's not recognized by the Majlis Khubregan, if you will, or the Jamil Mudarrisin. Sorry.
Okay, so does he have has he made known his position on this question?
I don't think so, but it's possible. I'll try to find out.
I would be very interested in knowing, because there's also other problems that come up if you try and look at these things in the light of what we know now through modern medical science.
Yeah.
Now let's look at the situation, another example, and these are important questions because they make us think further about the question, right? These kind of problems. What about the question of multiple births, of which the simplest case is the twin?
Okay.
Or triplets are also possible, but yeah, I mean, it gets more and more less, it gets less and less likely, right? But that's possible. And I don't know that if medical science is to the point that they know what causes the phenomenon of twinning.
Like, what's the exact question about it?
The question is then, does that, so originally nothing, so when you have the situation of the fertilized ovum, right? It's not a twin. It's potentially one individual, right? But at some point you get the phenomenon of twinning. Why? And if that's the case, so if you say
We're discussing biology now because it's about the
it completely relates to this biology and this they go together. Remember, the study of the soul is a part of physics, part of natural science.
But fertilization is about between the ovum and so it's sometimes be fertilization between the two ovum, and so you end up being more. If it's within the
it's identical twins.
If it is one, or it is two, it depends.
I'm talking about identical twins, not the fraternal twins.
You are talking about having.
So if you say that
and then it divides.
Yeah, if that's soul, then does that become two souls or three souls then? Because the idea that it's not divisible.
Interesting.
It's just a question. It's just a question.
You are going from the meiosis to the mitosis one now because it's.
I don't know. I'm not.
Yeah, so
it's like
So it's fertilization means that before it's supposed to be the two separate ones, and then they become unified to become one soul. So it means that your production of the soul, then we're going to call it. It's through this procedure, right? So they're supposed to be you understand them. Okay, so it's going to be like mitosis, meiosis, and then you need to understand the unification between them, and then the twinning. And I don't think it's the answer of the soul from that aspect. It's sort of
because it's two souls.
Yeah, but it's
If
coming
you have
from,
twins, it's two souls, but then when does, so the reason I'm asking this question is because then maybe we can determine when the soul actually comes, because in the case of twins, when does it become two individuals?
the time of
Again, immediately, so. Or do they even know? But that's worth investigating.
Yeah. Okay.
Do you have a biology book there or something? You've
No,
got
I'm
a-
No, so this is the Tawziyah Masail of I Jawadi Amali.
Oh, there's a Tawziyah, he has it, okay.
Yeah. So I'm looking, it says Sakti Janeen, page 375.
Uh-huh.
And I will see if I can read this here.
Okay.
375, where are you? Come on. All right. So here we are. اسقاط جنین جایز نیست
Acha.
هر چند قبل از 4 ماه باشد.
Aha.
Sharma.
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 Not even 6 weeks.
4 months.
Yeah.
So you've
No,
got
that is a so
you've got 4 months and you're in the clear.
Yeah.
crazy. So it
Okay, she
means
says
that,
that's crazy.
because it means
So-
that if there is something wrong in the development, he
That's like
is giving
halfway.
you, yeah, but he is giving you the permission because all the tests happened before the 4 months to figure it out that there's nothing wrong with you.
Mm.
So these are istita'at, and it's based on questions. Here's one question. آیا سقط جنین پس از 3 یا 4 ماه بارداری جایز است? He replies سقط جنین حرام است و دیه دارد. So there's blood money, دیه. Then he says اسقاط جنین جایز نیست هر چند غیر طبیعی و دارای مشکلاتی یاد شده باشد. مادر در صورت رضایت و اختیار مانند پدر مسئول است و باید دیه پرداخت کند.
Diyet
So-
kisko denge?
That's what I'm saying. Abba ko denge, wo qatil kaun hai?
Yeah.
I don't know.
To the father,
So what, the physician has to pay the father?
the مسئول. Yeah. مادر در صورت رضایت و اختیار مانند پدر مسئول است. Okay, so the mom is just like the father is the مسئول و باید دیه پرداخت کند. I have no idea to who. To the office. I don't know.
Confusing.
Yeah. Yeah.
ये तो एक नई चीज हुई है वो तो अमीर हो जाएंगे बेचारे अगर यहाँ होंगे
Yeah, so he says 4 months. I don't know why though. It would be interesting.
This is what, so it always comes down to some sort of a hadith.
It's
I know that there have been books written on this, but I don't have access to them where I am. I mean, I'm sure that if I was at Princeton University, I could go in there and look up and find several works devoted to the legal status of abortion and Islamic law and Sunni and Shia. I'm sure I could find it, but I don't know. And of course there's the internet and all this, but I'm sure that there are works written on this. So
There has to be essays. There has to be essays floating around.
about what this
question of abortion as a
okay
Islamic law problem. But so the reason I'm interested in this is to see if any of these people who have researched this have approached it from this De Anima point of view. From
Right.
there's a book on the soul that has different our ulamas define soul, and in the book
what book is this?
I have the book just it's called Soul. Oh, God, that's like a book.
Oh. Soul, a comparative approach.
So up you can see
Christian Kanzian and Muhammad Legenhausen editors.
and I think Ayat Rajab is going to be
Oh, okay, so we've got Abdullah Jawad Amari, knowledge of the soul as path. Muhammad Fana'i Ishkawari,
Mhm.
Self-Knowledge in the Soul.
Yeah, he's the famous.
Is this
Uh,
the guy who teaches
epistemologist.
in England?
No,
But
there's
that's a
only
different
one guy.
Fana'i.
That's
He's the
that's
ethics guy.
good.
Yeah,
Ghulam
Ishkawari, he's an
Fayadi Hussain.
epistemologist.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a good book. Yeah, it is.
Oh, this looks pretty interesting.
Yeah.
That's edited by Liegenhausen.
Yeah.
I can share the PDF.
Please, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Can you make a group?
Yeah. So what do we do with the group? Should we make a Telegram or WhatsApp, a Signal?
The Telegram or WhatsApp both of them.
I think why should we have two? I mean, why don't we just go on?
The Telegram, yeah, Telegram is fine too.
Telegram is less restrictive. They have more allowance for sending
Right.
Larger files?
Uh-huh.
larger files.
Because I'm gonna
So-
save this and then just make this available.
Telegram, all right.
What
so
we've
let's
done today,
see,
I'll just save and make it available. Because I think
Right.
Bilal left.
Telegram.
I think he had to go somewhere.
Yeah, he left.
So can I have this number? Telegram.
Would you
Okay.
mind, Sayyid Hassan, Sayyid Tahniyat is taking the liberty to go ahead and make this, may we share your number?
By all means, yes.
Okay. It is still recording?
So
I'm
Yeah.
just-
I found the PDF.
Yeah. Like, okay. Okay.
What were you saying, Sayyid Hassan?
I think I found the PDF, the Liegenhausen one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I found it. I have it, and
Okay.
I'll upload these files as well. I'll upload these files on Telegram as well, and I made that file from Abdurrahman Badawi's Aristotle De Anima.
Oh, yes. So before you arrived, Tahniyat,
Mhm.
we were all talking and Ibn Sīnā had a Hashia on De Anima,
Okay.
but it's lost.
Yeah, so
So lost me, it didn't survive, but there is some version of it which was published. There's a book in Arabic called Aristotle De Anima by
okay.
Abdurrahman Badawi, and he has some portion of whatever survives from that Hashia, and that book is published. And I told him I didn't have one, but he found a PDF because this is an old book. Abdurrahman Badawi was an Egyptian scholar. Quran नहीं थे.
Okay.
ये किताब पता नहीं कुछ I don't know 50s में निकली हो, like 1900 पता नहीं 51-52 में निकली हो. So he found the PDF.
طبعته الثانية 1978.
Okay, second edition 78. It's an old
Yes.
book.
So the first one is probably older, yeah.
Yeah. I was just a guess. So
I'm not finding him on Telegram.
she's not finding you on Telegram.
That's good because
What? Did you remove yourself? You have
no.
have to
Okay, so what I will do is interesting. I don't know how you would find me because the name and the numbers are different actually.
okay.
Yeah, totally forgot you. I'm using my home number on Telegram.
Okay, hold on. Let me turn off the recording now, and then you can say your number. Okay, so we're concluding here. End the recording. Do I just click end?
Yeah.
So,
No, that'll end meeting for all. How do we just turn off the recording?
On the recording.
Here it is. Stop recording. Sorry.
Yeah.